research data reuse. Before we start, I will share a few housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded, and note that all attendees are muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, hold on, I see all sorts of pop-ups. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We'll take up questions in the discussion with our guest speaker of today. All attendees will receive a link to the recording later today, and the slides will be on Zenodo. And on behalf of the working group, we hope you will enjoy our webinar of today. We are very happy to have Sarah Lafia, Research Fellow at the ICPSR, for a webinar on measuring the impact of curatorial actions on research data reuse. Sarah is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, the ICPSR, at the University of Michigan. Her research is currently supported by an NSF project developing evidence-based data sharing and archiving policy, where she is analyzing curation activities, automatically detecting data citations, and contributing to the development of metrics for tracking the impact of data reuse. She holds a PhD in geography from University of California, Santa Barbara, and is also interested in geospatial applications, designing linked data models, and developing data visualizations. We expect that the presentation of Sarah will take about 35 minutes, so we'll have a good 20 minutes to discuss the work of Sarah and data curation activities at the ICPSR in particular. Sarah, having said this, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Rob, for that kind introduction. Again, my name is Sarah Lafia. I'm, as Rob said, a research fellow at ICPSR at the University of Michigan, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to present my ongoing research with my team. This is work that's been going on now for about half a year, and we have about 2 more years of our funded research. So this is all to say that these are early stages of our project, and this is a perfect opportunity for us to get more feedback and to engage with this community of practice and get some ideas early in the research. So with all of this being said as well, I want to try to make this online webinar as lively and interactive as possible. So to get some feedback, I'll pose questions throughout my talk, and I would like to try to check the question and answer and chat windows as often as possible. So please do feel free to send in any questions and comments as you think of them. So I want to begin by introducing my organization, ICPSR. ICPSR is a digital archive. As an organization, we have also over 50 years of experience curating both behavioral and social science data. We currently hold about 10,000 studies. These are made up of 250,000 different files, and these files often include supplementary information that is intended to help people reuse data. So these types of information include things like survey question text or reports about how studies were conducted. And of all these studies, about 1,500 of them are restricted, meaning that there are additional criteria that researchers need to meet in order to work with that data. This is done to protect the confidentiality of the subjects in that data. And ICPSR also maintains a very extensive bibliography of data-related literature that I'll talk about more today. This is an exciting resource because it's been developed over a number of years. There's a dedicated staff that maintain the bibliography, and it's currently manually curated, meaning that there's a team of dedicated researchers within ICPSR that actually comb through many different types of literature, including peer-reviewed articles, journal articles, preprints and that sort of thing to try to find instances of data citation and reuse from ICPSR. And this bibliography is a really useful tool for the research community as well. For one, it helps other researchers understand how others have used ICPSR data to build studies. It also allows new researchers to build on that existing research and to come up with new types of research questions. As of this summer, ICPSR had about 60,000 active users, and this number continues to grow as more people become familiar with the different resources that ICPSR offers. So in this talk, I will be describing data curation activities that are particular to ICPSR, but more broadly, that are applicable elsewhere. And these curation activities essentially focus on making sure that people can find and use data both now and in the future. And when curating social science or behavioral data, the curators at ICPSR work to improve the quality of any data that are deposited at the archive. And some of the actions that the curators take to do this include helping to make the data findable and usable by doing different things like adding tags to the metadata, completing documentation for the projects, and creating additional files that help others reuse the data in various kinds of statistical packages. Those are just some examples of curatorial actions that are done to data at ICPSR. So the motivation for the project I'm going to talk about today, and the context as well, is that both funding agencies and academic journals in recent years have presented different types of policies to shift toward open science. This is quite positive. It's intended to do many things, including advancing discoveries, allow others to evaluate, replicate, and verify results. But these policies to encourage data sharing, while they sometimes suggest places where researchers can deposit their data, for example, particular archives or databases where researchers can place their data, they do not yet provide specific guidance for how the data should be curated to make it easier for others to reuse and higher value. So this project that I'm going to talk about today asks a couple of critical questions, which are, what are the values and costs that are associated with sharing research data? We want to know how curation impacts data discovery and reuse downstream. And we also have unanswered questions about how to efficiently allocate data archiving resources to meet an increased demand for data sharing. I think this is really important, especially at this moment in the open science movement. So the project that I work on is called MICA. It stands for Measuring the Impacts of Curatorial Actions. And the goal is to develop metrics to evaluate both the impact and efficacy of specific data curation activities. So any of the work that goes into making data findable, or the first letter in the acronym FAIR, the findability aspect of data, things including the addition of metadata, the attachment of question text, work to add descriptions for how the data were collected or processed. These are all essential parts of the data curation process. And these steps are done to data deposited at ICPSR to add value and to ensure that the data are both findable and usable. So this project wants to know, how do we know which parts of curation matter most for data reuse? And there are many different ways we could characterize data reuse as well. These are different things we're considering right now in the project. For example, we have a primary or pilot study we've done already looking at the rates of data downloads as one measure of reuse. But we also are able to look at different aspects of data reuse. For example, data that are used specifically for teaching or instructional purposes or training, or specifically focusing on things like references made to data within the academic literature or within grant proposals. But overall, we want to understand the relationship that holds between data reuse and the amount of curation effort that archives like ICPSR put into preparing data for others to reuse it. So we have two main sources of funding for this research. One comes from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the other comes from the National Science Foundation, or NSF, and we're funded through the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Division. And overall, funding from both of these organizations speaks to their priority and interest in ensuring that investments in research data curation are able to have positive returns. And this is our team. It's quite large. It's made up of many different researchers, both from University of Michigan School of Information and ICPSR. And we're currently working together on the first phase of our project to gather information about priorities and perceived value of curation activities from different stakeholders. And having access to both ICPSR archive directors and data users is a very valuable aspect of our research. So our two main research questions are first, what impacts do specific curatorial actions have on research data's impact or reuse? And number two, how should we prioritize curatorial actions to achieve impact and return on investment? So our first question asks if there is a relationship between any curatorial action and data reuse. For example, if our curators spend quite a bit of time removing things like direct identifiers, um, or creating a codebook, for example, that helps users understand the different data variables, do these actions change whether the study is reusable? The second question, which is related, is then, given limited resources to support curation, where should ICPSR or other archives make sure that they spend those resources? So, for example, we know from looking through curation logs, for example, that um, spending time including question text for every survey is very intensive. It requires quite a bit of effort. Um, so it would be valuable to know whether it's absolutely necessary, for instance, to do this in all cases, or if it could be done more selectively um, for specific kinds of studies where we know that it makes a difference. So these are the kinds of trade-offs we're interested in measuring for the MICA project. And the goal is to know how to best allocate limited resources, both for preparing and preserving data. And we would like to be able to make suggestions based on empirical evidence that can support the effective and responsible use of curation resources. So our main activities in this project are the following phases. In the first phase, we want to understand values, priorities, and curatorial actions. So the members of our team that are primarily affiliated with the School of Information are conducting interviews with staff at ICPSR and investigators who use ICPSR data to try and understand priorities and expectations. So I saw one of the questions in the chat relates to this. It was asking how impact is defined in the context of data reuse. And so this first phase of our research is actually trying to um, hone in on the specific values that both, or that many different perspectives of data management value. So the way we're trying to get this information is through interviewing quite a few different staff members and data reusers at ICPSR. We want to know things like when a researcher, for example, decides to deposit data at ICPSR, what are the kinds of impacts that they expect, and how would they measure whether or not that decision was a good investment for them or for their research goals? So members of our team are also doing content analysis of curation logs. This is from the curation side. And what we're trying to do is to learn what curatorial actions are being taken and how much time is being spent on specific activities. In the second phase, once we have a better understanding of the priorities and values for curation, we will then focus on constructing measures of reuse and impact. And we're thinking about doing this in terms of a regression analysis, where we will look at how impact depends on the values and priorities of the curatorial actions of the studies themselves. In this phase, we want to be able to predict how often data might be reused based on any of the values that we identify in the first phase. And we also hope to use multivariate regression and structural equation modeling to assess those relationships as well. So for example, if curators, again, spend time attaching question text or make sure that the metadata are complete, we would like to be able to say that this has two times the likelihood of contributing to a data set being downloaded or clicked on, for example, as some measure of discovery. So the metrics are the way we measure the impact of each piece of curation. Another example would be when information about geographic coverage is provided. Are the research data reused more often? And then if we did find this to be true, it would let us know to make a recommendation or suggest that it is worth investing time and effort to produce high quality geographic metadata, for example. So this project, as I mentioned, is there are three main methods that we're using to assess stakeholder needs, priorities, and values for data reuse. The part of the project that I focus more on also experiments with some machine learning methods to both extract and then classify curation activities from work logs and to discover incomplete references to data in academic literature. And these methods, we hope, will allow us to associate different kinds of curation efforts with data reuse patterns and develop curatorial metrics that allow us to measure the impact of specific curation activities. At the end of this presentation, I have some early findings from an analysis we've done of data downloads, and this indicates some relationships among features of data sets, how intensively they're curated, and how often they're reused. So I'm part of the team that's looking at curatorial actions in the first phase. And so to give you a more concrete example of what we're working with, on the left, you can see an example of a work log that curators leave comments within. This is effectively a record or a trace of the different things, the processes that are done to improve the quality of a given study. And again, in this series of comments, you can see that there are a number of actions that curators take to process the data. These include things like masking variables or designating missing values. And there is a lot of variety in this language because these are sentences written by humans. And so we're using a computational approach to actually read and parse the text. And over the summer, we did try a more unstructured or unsupervised method to try to see if there were any patterns that would emerge. We used a method called topic modeling to try to pull out general themes from the work logs, but we found that this was not particularly useful because the language within these is fairly generic. So instead, because we have quite a good understanding within ICPSR based on our conversations with curators of some very typical types of actions that are taken often, we are instead developing a schema, which is shown on the right. And so this is something we're working on right now. We are hoping to finalize this the coming weeks, and so this is a perfect opportunity to get some early reactions from you on the schema. The goal with the schema here on the right is that we want to show or capture specific actions that are taken often within ICPSR to curate data, and these are both these are actions that have a lot of variety in terms of how long they take and how they are done to different levels of curation. For example, at ICPSR, there are 3 different levels, ranging from level 1, which is quite rapid, not much is done to the data, all the way up through level 3, which is more intensive and there are more specifications that the data sets have to meet in terms of quality. So these are the actions that we've identified that uh, that that are often done in these settings. And so for those of you familiar with curation, I'd really like to hear your feedback on the schema in particular, either in the chat now or maybe at the end of the presentation. In particular, I'd be curious to know if anything jumps out at you in terms of curatorial actions that might be missing. So please feel free at this point or later on, as I said, to share something in the chat or Q&A. For example, you might notice that things like creating specific types of data files is not represented here, but this is not in the schema because it's not something at ICPSR that's very time consuming. Another example of something that might be missing is are some actions related to documentation, but at ICPSR that's quite standardized. So the way that documentation is done, for the most part, is quite standardized. So some differences like this we can account for, but in general, if there are any top level categories, for example, that jump out at you or that you'd like to comment on, I would love to engage with you more about this schema of curatorial actions, because this will guide our work going forward. So I'll come back to this at the end during the discussion as well to see some of the comments. And I see a few some questions about the schema of curatorial actions of being available online. It isn't yet. We're using internally, we're using an online platform to build the schema. It's called BRAT or BRAT, and we eventually can make this public. There are a number of other schemas we also looked to in developing this. There's one in particular called the Data Practices and Curation Vocabulary, or DPC vocab. I think that came out about almost 10 years ago now. And some parts of that, some modules of that are relevant to our work, but we might consider incorporating some of those terms as well. But any other resources or other vocabularies that we might be interested in will be useful as well. Okay, so the second contribution of this work will be 2 measures of data reuse and impact. And so the goal of what I just showed is one part of understanding what actions are done to data. And on the other hand, we want to have ways to measure how the data are being reused and how intensely the data are being reused. So once we're able to identify specific curatorial actions, like in the first phase, things that are done to the data, we also want to know how those actions are related to some measures of data reuse and impact. So the 2 measures shown here are secondary impact and diversity. And these are the measures that we're primarily thinking of constructing to look at data reuse. So secondary impact is the number of times a study that reuses a particular data set is cited. So if we think about primary impact as the number of times a data set itself is cited, then we can look at secondary impact as a second level of citation. It looks at the number of times an article or a publication that uses a data set is cited. And the other measure of reuse is diversity, and this is meant to reflect the breadth of the different disciplines that use the data. So for example, just to make this more concrete, if a data set is cited very often, but only by political scientists, we would say that it has high secondary impact but low diversity. And then on the other hand, if a data set is reused or cited only a few times, but it's used by a biologist, a sociologist, and a political scientist, we would say that that data set has a low secondary impact but very high diversity. So our thinking is that these two measures can help us capture different kinds of reuse and impact. And the idea is that different researchers and funding agencies are interested in having different kinds of impact. And so we would like to be able to understand if there are particular curation steps on the one hand that we can take that will increase the likelihood of achieving secondary impact or diversity. And the goal here in building these measures is that we would like to be able to help researchers and funding agencies understand how they can best meet their specific goals for reuse and impact. And so this is another aspect of our work that's very early. We've identified these two measures as important and potentially useful for data citation and reuse. But that being said, I thought this would be really great to bring these two measures to this community because I'd like more feedback on these impressions of how of whether you feel these are appropriate for measuring data reuse, and also it would be great to hear what other measures of data reuse and impact we could consider if you're familiar with other measures. One thing that's quite new I'm interested in but not quite sure how to operationalize is this idea of data altmetrics. There are other interesting network-based measures we could consider as well, called eigenfactor metrics, but things like dataset centrality or connectivity would be interesting as well. So any other measures or ideas that you have would be really interesting for me to hear as well. And so the major piece I would say of this project that I'm working on is this idea of being able to track down data citations. So we have a resource available to use right now, and this is the current ICPSR bibliography of data-related publications that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. It's very comprehensive, but it's still a very low-end estimate of all of the publications that have resulted from analysis of data from ICPSR collections. And this is because there are two main problems with the way that data are currently cited in practice. The first is that many citations to research datasets are often incomplete. This means that the data references given to the data, possibly using a DOI. All of the datasets at ICPSR do have DOIs, but they're not often used. And if they are used, the articles may not include a reference to that data set in their reference list, for example. So knowing where to look within a particular article is challenging because we would have to be able to search full text for any reference to the data set. And another common error or challenge that's done in practice that makes it difficult is that the citation to the data set is indirect. So there isn't any formal attribution given to the data set. We aren't able to find a DOI within the article. And furthermore, the proper name of the study isn't used. So there are colloquial or common names for many of the studies at ICPSR. For example, the example shown here is this series called Monitoring the Future that's comprised of many, 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 many different data sets. And without using the identifier, it's difficult to know which study or studies within this series were used. So there's a lot of disambiguation and inference that needs to happen in order to automate this process. But what we're hoping to do is we want to take advantage of existing APIs right now to help us in this process, because the way that the bibliography is currently maintained is very time consuming, but it's also very high quality. So as I said before, there are dedicated staff at ICPSR that have set up RSS feeds that alert them every time a particular study DOI or name is mentioned. And they have to manually go through the full text and check whether or not it's an appropriate mention or if it's a formal or an informal citation and so forth. So we're currently experimenting with a number of different services we have available. These include Google Scholar for one, which is very promising but frustrating since they don't offer any sort of API to leverage. We're also hoping to take advantage of Crossref and DataCite as well. And there are other services that we can use. We're not sure if we would like to invest, including Scopus and Science Direct, which would give us the ability to do full text search. But the idea here is to use as many of these types of services as possible to retrieve any possible mentions and return them to the ICPSR bibliography team so that they can evaluate their quality. And this is the third piece I'd really like to hear more about from you, if you have expertise. I'd like to know if your institutions do anything similar, what services do you use, and the important question as well, what do you consider as a high quality data citation? Would you also find value in capturing things like more of the data altmetrics, the informal mentions, data that are reused for training activities and that sort of thing? So again, any general comments or ideas in the chat box would be very appreciated as well. So the end goal with these three phases is to develop metrics for curatorial metrics that can help guide how the data are curated. So this model that I'm showing here is one version of a structural equation model that we might be using. And the idea is to try to understand the many different relationships that might hold between things that are done to the data and how they are used later on. So in the upper left, you can see some particular measures of data reuse that include things like diversity, secondary count, primary count, the number of page views a dataset has, the number of downloads, the number of users, etc. These are all properties or features of data at ICPSR. And then at the bottom of this diagram, you can see some properties that are particular to ICPSR, like whether or not the data are available for online analysis or if they're restricted. And then on the right, you can see properties of the dataset and the metadata that we think might also influence impact and reuse. And then the very upper right in the beige, you can see some measures that are associated with particular curation steps. And so this type of modeling will allow us to understand relationships between data reuse and curation, and also see how other properties contribute to this. And so throughout the duration of our project, for the next 2 years, we're hoping to get as many different labels and values for these connections as possible. So just to give you an idea of what we've done already, we did run a very small pilot study that looked just at data downloads at ICPSR as one possible measure of reuse. And we wanted to see whether or not there were factors that influenced whether a particular study is downloaded. So this frequency table shows the number of data sets that were released each year that we considered. And you can see that it does fluctuate over time, but we do account for this. And so we ran a regression analysis to understand if any properties of the studies themselves or curation activities influenced how often data were downloaded. So in this case, just to define some of the terms here, the term series here means whether or not data were part of an ongoing series of studies. One popular series at ICPSR is called the American National Election Survey that's released each election cycle. and it gets updated. We also looked at how many variables the studies had and whether or not it had a single primary investigator or PI or multiple. And these are all treated as properties of the study itself. We also looked at curation activity. So sponsored, in this case, sponsorship or sponsored means that an organization, for example, a popular one at ICPSR is the National Institute of Justice, but it essentially means that an organization pays for the data to be curated and supports that. And then intense curation here means that some level of attention was received from the curation staff. And then the number of metadata terms considers how many search terms are attached to any given study. So looking at all of these factors, we found that being part of a series and having a single PI were negatively associated with more downloads, and all the other factors were positively associated with being downloaded more frequently. So to summarize, if a study has a sponsor, if it goes through some curation, and if it has more metadata terms, users are more likely to download the data. And this could be because the curation process makes the metadata more complete and possibly easier for users to understand. The inclusion of additional metadata terms also might help users find the data in different ways using different searches, but we're not sure. These are just our best guesses about why. But model 3 that's shown in the last column here, we found to be the best performing, and it shows that when we do account for curation, we're able to have a better understanding of why more downloads might occur. So the next part of our project is going to try to understand within each of these actions what specifically is influencing the user's ability to find the data and to actually do something with it. And just in summary, our predictions were that curation activities would increase the number of downloads, and we found that that was supported. We also wanted to know which curation activities would have the most impact on data downloads, and we found that sponsorship and intense curation had the strongest contribution. Some things that were surprising, we had predicted that bigger studies, for those that had more variables, for example, would be downloaded more often because we thought that they might have more analytic utility, but we did not find that to be true. And we also predicted that series that series would receive more downloads because they might have more sustained interest over time, but we also didn't find this to be true. We're interested to know if this means that less of the research done at ICPSR is longitudinal, maybe more as point in time, where a researcher is very interested in a particular period of time, but not at the survey going over a longer period of time itself. We're not sure. But these are things we're interested in understanding later on and doing more investigation. So a takeaway is, what do these findings mean for data depositors? So just a small takeaway from this pilot suggests that overall curation has an impact on data downloads and that it matters. But we bear in mind that data downloads are just one possible measure of reuse. They're an important one to consider because downloading data is often a precursor to doing something with it and citing it later in literature, but that's just one part of the equation. And so we did find out that sponsorship or finding some kind of organization that wants to support the curation of deposited data does make a difference. And for people depositing data, this also means that curation, especially the inclusion of things like metadata terms and having well-documented variables, does make data more likely to be downloaded. Just a small plug for some resources available through ICPSR. If you're interested to know how ICPSR prepares data for archiving, this is a guide that was just, it's the 6th edition that came out this year. It has interesting information about how curators at ICPSR create code books, which define and describe variables. And it also talks about how ICPSR collects and outlines the different metadata standards that ICPSR uses, including the Data Documentation Initiative, or DDI. And these steps are important because we see that overall curation does correlate with downloads, but we have much more to do in our analysis. We're interested in completing the data curation lifecycle. So instead of just looking at data downloads, next we're going to look at how the data are cited in literature and try to capture some of the impact that these data citations may have in the long run. So to conclude, overall, I'd like to remind you that our main goal of this project is to develop curatorial metrics to evaluate the impact and efficacy of specific data curation processes. And this, in the long run, should help us understand where to spend our resources. And this work is supported by the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Science Foundation. So I'm looking forward to spending some time now going through the Q&A and having a more a dynamic conversation with all of you. And if you have other questions or ideas that come up later that I'm not able to answer today, I'd also love to hear from you through email or Twitter. So thank you very much for your attention and for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Well, a good number of questions came through the chat. Maybe we can have a look together, and sure. Some are answered already, I think, to some extent. But looking at the question, is there one that you would particularly react to immediately or pick out?
There's some really great comments and resources. I see some articles I will be looking at after this. I'm very excited about. Let's see. Some questions about, yes, the schema. Let me go back. There was a question about what the acronyms meant. There was one in particular called DRR. That's the Disclosure Risk Review. That's anything that's done to evaluate identifiers within the data set that might help, or that might mean that the data could be that the aggregated data could be de-anonymized. So this is often a very time-consuming part of curation, where each variable needs to be checked, and there are often actions that come with this as well, like if there is geographic information included, or if it's a sensitive population, there's masking that's done. So sometimes entire parts of the data will be removed or changed or modified in some way. So that's one of the categories here shown in orange that we are going to try to pull out from the curator work logs. And we think that this is going to be something we find is quite time consuming. So that's a priority.
Okay. Let me look at the chat. So I think some of the people are interested in how to set up such a workflow and whether it can be done. So the ICPSR has a whole team of dedicated curators. I think many libraries don't have the luxury to work with a large specific curational team. Can it be done with a one-woman band or a small band? What would be your advice for libraries taking up or developing these type of services?
Yes, yeah, that is ICPSR it has many components, many people with expertise in different areas. So as I mentioned before, yes, there is a curation team. They're a dedicated team. I saw somebody else had asked also about who are the team, what are their backgrounds. We have a specific group of individuals that look at, they focus on this data curation, and they work within particular archives within ICPSR, so they often have subject area expertise with the data that they're dealing with. For example, we have quite a bit of criminal justice data, and so we have curators that have more of an interest or background in that, working on those. But for organizations that don't have dedicated teams of researchers maintaining bibliographies or curating data, fortunately, I think there are still it's quite a bit of work to undertake as one person, but there increasingly, I would say, at least from ICPSR perspectives, there's more guidance coming out now, uh, even to point specific researchers to follow, like best practices for creating your own metadata, for naming your study variables, and so forth. That was part of the reason I included um, that mention of that guide that ICPSR puts forward. Part of what another program that ICPSR offers every summer is the Summer Institute for new researchers. And I think it's a really great way to train the next generation of scientists and let them know about some of these best practices as they move forward. Because increasingly, I think unfortunately, too, the burden of curation increasingly falls on researchers who are also doing self-deposit if they don't have resources to partner with organization like ICPSR. So in those cases, I think there's some very good guidance coming out about how to curate your own data for self-deposit. But yeah, that's a very good question about what can be done on one's own. So.
Right. Thanks. Then I see a question of Philip Conzet. How does data curation in ICPSR work? And then specifically, do data curators carry out changes, additions to deposited data themselves?
Yes, there are a sequence of systems that facilitate multiple people working in teams to curate the data, and changes are made to the data. All of the changes that are made to the data are tracked in a log file, so that it's done automatically, but it leaves some kind of trace, so that at the end, when the depositors can look through the changes that were made and approve them, and that's done through the result is essentially a statistical file readout that's given and reviewed, but yeah, there are actual changes made to different things like variable names, spelling, and that sort of thing. Yes.
Okay. And then another very important question, I think, is from Astrid Brunet. That is on training, so the training related to curation. So what is the background of people working at the ICPSR working with curational activities, and what is needed for the future? Should these people have what does a training for curation look like? Should we prepare for more data science type of skills to looking at the field of how curation will likely evolve?
Yes, I know, at least I can say from the ICPSR perspective, many curators have, because it is a social science and behavioral science archive, many curators have a background in the social sciences and a passion for that as well. Some also have a background in library sciences, but not at all. In terms of data science, I know that's an emerging, at least at the University of Michigan, that's an emerging area of interest and commitment. There are a number of data curators who have been independently pursuing training and through the Data Science Institute, and taking advantage of learning more skills with Python and that sort of thing. But I think that's possibly a newer phenomenon. I'm interested also to see how what the data science turn looks like in the curation world. But I can say, at least from the ICPSR perspective, that it's quite a diverse group of people. I think the common thread is that many, if not all, have some connection to social science research.
Okay. And then question I had myself, do you have any metrics itself on curation of data sets as an activity and the curational actions involved? And then I mean in terms of number of staff hours per data set or number of hours spent, maybe also related to the types of curation, the three types of curation, ranging from sort of general descriptive to more in-depth curated data sets.
Yeah, that's something we're trying to. There isn't well, the curators themselves and the management within curation is very interested in knowing this as well. So they do keep track of things like how much time is spent on any given study. That's why we have those work logs. They have actual timestamps associated with um, in the tickets of how long a curator is spending on a particular phase of curation, and also keeps track of how like what comments or correspondence is sent among members of a various team. But for our purposes, we're interested in information that's a bit more granular. So while we have overall an impression of how much more, like the order of magnitude of how much more time is spent on intensive curation versus minimal curation or self-deposit, we don't yet know roughly how much time is spent on a particular phase or particular type of curation activity. For example, that the activity I mentioned earlier of disclosure risk review, DRR, that we don't know. We have an intuition from talking to curators and from looking at the work logs that this is very time consuming, but we don't have evidence yet that we know how much time is spent on that phase. So that's why we're trying to go through and annotate or tag the work logs to try to find all the instances of when that is being done. But that's the next phase of this work.
Okay. And let's say in the case we would have 1 hour, and I could spend that 1 hour in terms of letting the curator add additional metadata, or spend that hour going out, reaching out to a researcher and doing an interview and asking what he expects and how we can help him. What should we do? Should we reach out to the researcher or invest in the addition of metadata?
That's exactly those are the types of trade-offs we're interested in. I would say part of why we want to develop the metrics is because, well, at ICPSR, each data depositor has a relationship with the archive that's managing the data. And so I think what would be important is to know early on what type of impact that for example, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, if they're sponsoring the project, if they really want community outreach to be their end goal, they want the data to be easy for the public to use, then maybe it's more important to spend that hour on preparing high quality metadata that's very well described, that explains how the data were collected, and that might be ultimately more valuable for community members to be able to find in the future rather than spending that hour on something else. But I think the point is also to be able to differentiate the priorities and then make recommendations based on that differentiation. If there's a different outcome that the stakeholder has in mind, then maybe there's a way to optimize curation for that outcome as well.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we have time for a last question or so. Let's see. Well, as you said, you prefer feedback also on the schema and the APIs and what a data citation should or could look like, and how to improve the all sorts of activities and metrics that are related to a good data citation. What's the question to the audience? So maybe it's a good idea if there are any further questions that we could and answers and feedback that we can channel to you through you. in terms, I think the topics that you're interested in, we are also interested in, right? And to see what APIs are available or what are best practices with respect to data citation, for example. I think that's of great interest. And the schema that I saw versus the curate model and a variety of models that can be used and are used in practice or starting to be used. I think it's good to communicate extensively on that. And I hope with the webinar we set a first step to well um, to stimulate and nourish that connection that we have with ICPSR as of today, right? Yeah, looking at the time, we still have not that much time in terms of starting, I think, in-depth discussion. What should be the key message to the audience in Europe, knowing that so US probably is more advanced in setting up and developing curational services?
Yeah, so I think there are several dimensions which I touched on in this talk that I think would be of interest in the coming months, if not year, for this audience. I hope we can stay in touch, and I can continue to get feedback from this community. This has been really valuable. I also think one of the major contributions of this work, hopefully, will be these metrics. I would also hope that they are contextualized enough that they would be relevant in some of the settings in which many people in this community work, for example, in the research data library community. It would be really interesting to see, because ICPSR is we are primarily a data archive within the social sciences. It would be interesting to see how relevant these metrics are in other domains. It would be also interesting to see in international context as well, if maybe there's interesting variation in priorities or open access or any other factors that would influence the fairness of data, their potential for reuse, and that sort of thing. So I think I can see many things on the horizon that would lend themselves well to future testing or partnerships with this community as well. So this is very exciting.
Thank you very much again. Yeah, having said all this, I think thank you again. Thank you very much for a very interesting webinar today. And yeah, I think we will look at the questions that came in, all of them, and maybe you want to react to one of these or the questions that we didn't find the time to answer today. Yeah, we'll to the audience either get back to Sarah directly or communicate through the through LIBER, through the working group, and we will make sure that questions are forwarded or that discussions and material is collated as far as we can.
Perfect.
Thanks again, and yes, hope to stay safe, as they say right now. And yeah, thank you all for attending, and I hope you found it worth your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much as well. This has been a great opportunity for me to connect with so many people remotely. So this has been really fabulous as a researcher. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Enjoy your day, US.
Bye. Thank you very much.